Thank you. It is really lovely to be here with you. I am pleased that these lights let me at least see you a bit. I preached at the midnight service at St Andrew's in Sneyd Green, and it was just, there was no lights anywhere else, and I was just blinded by these things, and I could have just been preaching into the sort of void of the night. So it is good to be able to see at which point you fall asleep. I'm going to read to us from Joshua chapter 1. Here we go, Joshua chapter 1. After the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord said to Joshua, son of Nun, Moses' aide, Moses, my servant, is dead. Now then, you and all these people, get ready to cross the river Jordan into the land I am about to give to them, to the Israelites. I will give you every place where you set your foot, as I promised Moses. Your territory will extend from the desert to Lebanon and from the great river, the Euphrates, all the Hittite country to the Mediterranean Sea in the west. No one will be able to stand against you all the days of your life. As I was with Moses, so I will be with you. I will never leave you nor forsake you. Be strong and courageous, because you will lead these people to inherit the land I swore to their ancestors to give to them. Be strong and very courageous. Be careful to obey all the law my servant Moses gave you. Do not turn from it to the right or to the left, that you may be successful wherever you go. Keep this book of the law always on your lips. Meditate on it day and night, so that you may be careful to do everything written in it. Then you will be prosperous and successful. Have I not commanded you? Be strong and courageous. Do not be afraid. Do not be discouraged, for the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go. This is the word of the Lord. There you go. You are all Anglicans, really. We've already had lots of people talking about a new year and thinking about a new year and maybe what God is calling us to as part of the churches within this city of Stoke. And that reading I've just read from Joshua is one that's often used at new beginnings, isn't it? So I wonder, as we've just read about God's call to Joshua, how you're going to make sure that you follow God's call well this year. How are we going to make sure that we follow God's call well together this year? How will we follow God's call when all that stuff we've just sung about God, we know and we believe is true, and yet we've been told in advance to expect this to be a tough year? Often in a new year, we look back and we see things that have been difficult in the previous year. That's not particularly a tough job to do, is it? And yet we then think, this is a new start. Let's look forward with hope. And yet we've already started with the NHS in crisis, with economic uncertainty, with lots of strikes going on, warnings that household bills and therefore poverty the bills will get higher, the poverty will get worse. Putin's made a fresh commitment to keep the war in Ukraine going. How might we follow God's call well in the coming year when that's the reality in which we're living? Now, a traditional way of trying to make sure we have a good year is to make New Year's resolutions. Are you someone who makes New Year's resolutions?
Why don't we ever mention the fucking homeless people?
Some people make New Year's resolutions. Some people don't. It did occur to me.
Homeless people who can't get shit. They be sick.
It did occur to me that It did occur to me that maybe I should make a New Year's resolution this year. I never normally do them, but having 2 out of 2 in the previous 2 years, I've managed to slice my fingers fairly seriously in the kitchen, that maybe I should make a New Year's resolution not to do that again this year. If you look at statistics, the number of people who do make New Year's resolutions is rising. It's gone up. It was sort of going down, but something's happening in the last couple of years. And the number of people who are feeling that there's something they need to do at the start of a year to sort of bring some hope and possibility is going up. But there's a couple more of interesting statistics when you look at them. Firstly, most New Year's resolutions fail. Now, I really, really hope that my resolution not to slice my fingers off again doesn't fail. But apparently only 7 to 8% of those who make resolutions keep them beyond the end of January. Why? Well, we make resolutions, and really, don't we? Because there's an initial determination that we can make life better. But of course, that rapidly wanes over time. Results aren't immediate. People sign up to go to the gym. And then when by the end of January, they haven't got the most super-toned body, they're not ready to compete in the Olympics, they give up again. Discouragement sets in, however good these great intentions have been in the first place. I was quite shocked to discover that I am actually showing signs of aging. Do you know what sign of aging I'm showing? Well, yeah, don't tell me. I don't need to know all those. But the one I was shocked to discover is we stop making New Year's resolutions with age. It's something younger people tend to do, but something happens as we grow older that stops us doing that anymore. I've said that our reading that I read from Joshua is often used at new beginnings. God is calling Joshua to lead his people into the promised land. And it's easy, I think, to hear this reading. I don't know what was going through your mind as I read it. It's easy to hear it in the same way as I've just talked about our new resolutions. Great determination. We read repeatedly Joshua being told, be strong and very courageous. And we can think, okay, how's God calling me to follow him this year? Maybe I need to grit my teeth. I need to muster up whatever strength and determination I can to go out there and follow where he leads. If I'd have carried on reading a few more chapters, we'd have got to the famous story that everyone knows largely from when they're children. It's the story where Joshua leads the Israelites to march around the city of Jericho. And after 7 days of marching, Jericho, the city, simply crumbles to the ground. Just think of all those things that you might think of a Jericho in your life. The challenges, the difficulties that you just think, if I grit my teeth and I can be faithful to God and be strong and courageous, then I will just see those things crumble. Maybe challenges and the difficulties of this city, the issues around poverty and homelessness that our friend over here was talking to us about. But the reality is that when we live our Christian lives like that, we very quickly, at least in my experience, fail. My ability to be determinedly strong and courageous is not as great as I would like it to be. The Jerichos of our life sometimes do fall as God works in his power, but they don't always. And it's so easy to become discouraged. The good news is that I think when we look at this story of Joshua more closely, it is a story of dealing with new beginnings and new starts. But we actually see a very, very different picture of how God works. The phrase, be strong and very courageous, is used repeatedly. But what does it mean? There is no suggestion in the way God talks to Joshua that God is saying, come on, Joshua, psych yourself up and get on with this. In the start of the reading, between verses 2 and 6, in just those few verses, God uses the word I 7 times. He says, get ready to cross the Jordan into the land I am about to give to them, the Israelites. I will give you every place, as I promised Moses. I was with Moses, so I will be with you. I will never leave you or forsake you. You will lead these people to inherit the land I swore to their ancestors to give to them. This great passage of call to Joshua is not about Joshua's determination. It is all about God and what God is doing and what God is going to do. When we come to that amazing story of Jericho, the walls of Jericho don't fall because Joshua manages to be determined enough in his praising. The walls fall because God makes them fall. So God's command to Joshua is not to go and be a great hero, but to be strong and courageous through modeling 3 simple behaviors in his life. And they conveniently can be put together with the letter P, which makes a good Anglican sermon. First thing is about remembering God's promises. God reminds Joshua about what he has already done in the life of the people of Israel, as to what he promises he has already given to Moses. The promise to lead them into the promised land was given 40 years previously, but 40 years makes absolutely no difference to the validity of his promise. It might have felt like that to people who were living through it and wish that God would have chopped his timescales a bit shorter and just got on with it. But God knew what he was doing, and nothing would change his promise. He would work in his time when he was ready. There will have been many events in that time in the community of births and deaths and times of rejoicing, times of frustration and bewilderment. But nothing could change God's promise. So the first way Joshua had to go about being strong and courageous was simply to remember God's promises. Then he had to remember God's principles. He says, be careful to obey all the law my servant Moses gave you. Do not turn from it to the right or to the left. Keep the book of this law always on your lips. Meditate on it day or night. God primarily wants us to know him. His call is to relationship with him. Way back before this, when he first called Abraham, he says to Abraham, walk before me and be holy. Walk before me and be blameless. You've done it a different translation. That's what God primarily wants. Didn't give Abraham any other instructions. In talking to Joshua about remembering the law, meditate on it, it's what they had of this is how you get to know God and who he is. This is how you build a relationship with him. If we want to follow God, if we want to follow where he is calling us to, then we need to remember his principles and focus on knowing who he is and allowing our relationship with him to grow. I, a while ago, was in IKEA, that hideous place, and although I am sad that they've said they won't build one in Stoke, that would have been more convenient. And I was with a friend and two of my godchildren, and we were looking at something that I can't remember, I think in the bathroom department, and suddenly turned round. One child is this size, so they were being carried, that was easy. Other child who's that size, we suddenly turned around and he was no longer there. Where'd he gone? We had no idea. And I started thinking, look, there's so many, nooks and crannies and where he might have gone. This is going to be impossible. How do we know which way to go to find where he's gone? And yet his mum says he won't. He'll have gone straight through the quickest route where everyone else is going. So I speed up, sort of legging it after him. And lo and behold, after, I'm sure it was only a couple of minutes, it felt like much more. There I find this child who by that stage has realised he's lost us and he's stood there crying. His mum knew him so well. She knew which way he would have gone, and she was right. When Joshua is called to follow God's call, God says, remember, you need to know who I am, because that is how you will know where to go. And then the third P is remembering God's presence. God promises, God's principles, and God's presence. Throughout the Bible, there is the constant truth that our God is not a distant God. Even back in Genesis, God comes to have a walk in the garden with Adam and Eve. He comes and meets with Abraham. There's all sorts of other people in between, but it'll take a long talk if I go through all of them. When he's been leading his people out of Egypt, he's with them in the pillar of cloud by day and a fire by night. He is there with them all the time. This is even before we get anywhere near the New Testament and the incarnation and God sending his Holy Spirit. Being with his people is part of God's nature. And of course, those 3 P's of God continue through and are magnified in when we look at Jesus in the Gospels. The Bible is the story of God's promise. God's promise when we have wandered away from him to restore us, to give us opportunity to come back to him. His promise that if we do that, then he will take us eventually at that time when Jesus returns in glory at the end of the Bible in Revelation. He will take us to be with him then. Some of God's promises come about very quickly. At other times, there is lots of waiting. Just think of those centuries between those Old Testament prophecies we've just read in our Christmas services and Jesus actually being born in Bethlehem. There's a long time has been happening between when Jesus was walking on earth physically and Jesus has not yet returned in all his glory. But God is a God of promise, and the fact that there is a time lapse does not change or negate those promises, because we consistently see that in God's time, God fulfills his promises. Jesus promised all who believe in him salvation. He promised life in all its fullness. He promised he will build his church. He will build his kingdom. And we can trust that that is true. We see the P of God's principles continued in the New Testament. God's primary call being to us to have a relationship with him. If you look at what Jesus says to people, one of his favorite phrases is simply, follow me. Follow me. That's what Jesus wants. Yes, he does send his disciples off to do great things, to go and teach and preach. At the end, when Jesus gives the Great Commission, he commissions the disciples to go into all the world and make disciples of all peoples. But this is after he's got in the first important message, follow me. I want to know you, and I want you to know me. I'm remembering God's presence. What is the gift that Jesus left us, that he sent after he had returned to heaven at the ascension? He sent the Holy Spirit, his Holy Spirit, to be with us. I will be with you to the end of the age, he says to his disciples. God's command to be strong and courageous is God's invitation to know and remember who he is. And for that not to be just a bit of information that's stored away in the back of our minds, but something we actually choose to do, to remember, to be strong and courageous, so that it can transform our lives, so that we are then putting ourselves in a place on a solid foundation where God can do God's work in us and through us, just as he did with Joshua.